There's a moment in every staged crime where the performance ends. It doesn't happen all at once. It doesn't arrive with a confession or a dramatic reveal. It happens quietly, when the details stop lining up, when the story has to be told one too many times, when evidence refuses to cooperate. In part 1, we watched a lie take shape, a word written in blood, a narrative that pointed outward instead of inward, a story built to redirect attention, buy time, and restore control one last time. And for a while, it worked. Investigators followed the name on the wall. A former boyfriend became the center of gravity. The man who found the body was treated as a witness, not a suspect. But lies don't fail because they're immoral. They fail because they're fragile. Forensics doesn't care who you want blamed. Cell towers don't care what story you rehearsed. And witnesses, especially the ones that you choose yourself, don't always stay quiet. Part 2 is where the illusion collapses. This is the point where timelines are dismantled minute by minute, where expert testimony strips emotion from the equation, where a staged message becomes evidence of intent, not innocence. It's also where we confront something harder than guilt, because this case was never about who killed Karen Pannell. It was about why the lie was necessary in the first place, why control had to be reasserted, even after her voice was silenced. Tonight, we step into the courtroom. We follow how prosecutors reconstructed the final hours, how a carefully planted distraction turned into proof of staging, and how the man who tried to rewrite Karen's last moments was forced to face the version of the story that evidence tells when no one is in control anymore. This is not the loudest part of the story. It's the most unforgiving, because once the truth takes a stand, it doesn't blink, and neither should we. Hey Angela, how's it going tonight?
That's good, John. How are you?
Good. I'm really good. Yeah. Got through the whole holiday chaos and kind of back into normality, which I always really like.
It's a little bittersweet.
Yeah, I know that you have like this. Yeah.
I miss the magic. I need some. There needs to be something magical in January, February, March. It's just I read it once that it's just a cold gray bucket of suck, and it kind of is.
Well, let's see what we can do about making some magic this month, next month.
Make some magic.
All right. So, well, anyway, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're
back at it.
So welcome back, listeners, to Dark Dialogue, the podcast where we examine the cases that haunt small towns and big cities alike. I'm your host, John.
And I'm your co-host, Angela. And together we unravel the shadows of the human mind, looking at how ordinary lives intersect with violence, control, and truth.
This is part 2 of our investigation into the murder of Karen Pannell. In part 1, we explored Karen's life, the discovery of her body, and a crime scene that seemed to explain itself. A name written in blood that pointed investigators in the wrong direction. Tonight, we follow what happens when the story stops holding up.
This episode isn't about shock value, it's about process. About how timelines, forensic evidence, and testimonies slowly dismantle a narrative that was designed to distract. Cases like this matter because they show how easily appearances can be manipulated and how difficult it can be to regain the truth once that happens.
Before we dive in, take a second to support the show in the simplest way possible. If you're listening or watching right now, please like, share, subscribe, and leave a review. Give us a thumbs up and hit that bell. Follow the show, whatever your platform allows. Those small actions help this episode reach more people and keep stories like Karen's from fading away.
They really do matter. Engagement tells the platforms that this kind of work deserves to be seen and heard.
This episode includes discussions of domestic violence, homicide, and courtroom testimony. Please take care of yourselves while listening. All right, so let's jump into part 2.
Sure thing.
So before we step into the courtroom, it's important to ground ourselves in where this investigation stood at the end of part 1. Karen Pannell was found stabbed to death inside her Oldsmar home in October of 2003. Near her body, written in blood on the kitchen wall, was a single word: ROC, rock. At first glance, it appeared to be a dying declaration, a final attempt to identify the person responsible. The message immediately shaped the direction of the investigation. Rock was the name of Karen's former boyfriend. Their relationship had been volatile, marked by arguments and prior police involvement. On paper, the name fit perfectly. History fit. Motive appeared to fit. And in those first hours, the crime scene seemed to be pointed outward, away from the person who had discovered her body. That person was Timothy Permenter. Tim was Karen's on-again, off-again boyfriend at the time of her death. He was the one who entered the home that morning. He was the one who called 911, and initially, he was treated as exactly what he presented himself to be, the grieving partner who had walked into a nightmare. But as investigators moved beyond the surface, the story began to change. Forensic analysis raised serious questions about the message on the wall, when it was written, how it was written, and whether Karen could have written it at all. At the same time, Rock's alibi held. Witnesses placed him elsewhere, and physical evidence failed to connect him to the crime scene. Meanwhile, evidence began to accumulate around Tim. A pizza delivery guy placed him inside Karen's home later than he claimed. Cell tower data contradicted his account of leaving early. Neighbors reported seeing his car at the residence throughout the night, and DNA evidence connected him directly to the violence inside the kitchen. What initially looked like a case solving itself, a name written in blood, began to look like something else entirely. Not a final message, a staged one. By the end of part one, investigators reached a critical conclusion. The writing on the wall wasn't leading them to the killer. It was leading them away from him. And with that realization, the focus of the case shifted decisively from a volatile former boyfriend to the man who had reported discovering Karen Pannell's body. That's where we left the investigation, and that's where part two begins.
I feel like dun 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 is appropriate here.
Dun 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 is appropriate.
Dun. Okay.
So as we discussed at the end of part one, the investigation into Karen's murder reached a turning point when the evidence stopped supporting the story written on the wall. And it started pointing squarely at the man who had reported finding her body. By that stage, detectives were no longer weighing competing theories. They were watching a cumulative case come together. Tim Permenter was ultimately arrested and charged with first-degree murder after investigators concluded that the word rock was staged and that no other viable suspect fit the evidence. That decision didn't hinge on any single discovery. It came from the collapse of Tim's entire timeline, the forensic findings inside the home, and his own behavior in the hours and days after the killing. So as we already know, Tim's alibi was the first major fracture. He claimed that he left Karen's townhouse around 7:30 on the night that she was killed, and that he was already driving north on US 19 when he placed a 9:32 p.m. phone call. But investigators obtained his T-Mobile records and learned that the call did not hit a tower along the highway. Instead, it routed through a tower within roughly a mile of Karen's home, placing him near the scene at the time when he said that he was long gone. So that technical evidence didn't just stand alone. So as we already discussed, the Pizza Hut delivery driver placed Tim inside Karen's home close to 9 o'clock, directly contradicting his claim that he had left much earlier. Multiple neighbors then reported seeing his BMW outside the townhouse later that night around 10 p.m., 2 a.m., and again at 5 a.m. Taken all together, those accounts dismantled the version of events that Tim had given detectives. At the same time, the forensic focus shifted decisively away from Rock Herpich. Analysts determined that the word rock was written over dried blood spatter, not during the assault itself. The writing pattern appeared consistent with a right-handed stroke, even though Karen was left-handed, and there was also no physical evidence tying Rock to the crime scene at all, and his alibi held up under intense scrutiny. So what initially looked like a dying declaration now looked like staging. And once that conclusion was reached, the remaining evidence took on a completely new weight. Laboratory testing showed Tim's DNA mixed with Karen's blood at the scene, including material recovered from beneath her fingernails. That supported a close, violent struggle, not a brief visit hours earlier. Investigators then turned to Tim's claimed Newport Richie alibi. As we covered previously, George Solomon described a late-night meeting at a gas station where Tim appeared visibly shaken and asked him to cover for him. Later that night, George said that Tim confessed that he had killed Karen following an argument. That statement didn't exist in isolation either. It fit the broader picture that detectives were assembling. As the case solidified, investigators also documented Tim's background and potential motive. They uncovered his extensive violent criminal history, including a prior attempted murder case and involvement in pimping, details that Karen had only recently learned. As we discussed earlier, Karen had been trying to end the relationship and had called 911 during a domestic incident roughly 10 or 11 days before she was killed. So by this point, detectives believed that they were looking at a domestic violence homicide followed by deliberate staging. With probable cause established, the state attorney's office presented the case to a grand jury, and in 2004, the grand jury returned an indictment charging Tim Permenter with first-degree murder. Once indicted, Tim was taken into custody. Open reporting indicates that the murder case dovetailed with a parole violation issue. Tim was already under supervision from earlier felony convictions, and investigators determined that he had left his approved county without permission to visit a friend in Pasco County. That violation provided a mechanism to lock his ass down immediately while the homicide case moved forward. So from that point on, Tim remained in custody. There is no indication in any reporting that he was meaningfully released on any kind of bond or any shit like that. So facing a capital charge and carrying an extensive felony record, he was incarcerated from shortly after the indictment through the trial. So by the time the case reached a pretrial posture in Pinellas County, the path forward was clear. Tim Permenter was charged with first-degree murder for stabbing Karen Pannell 16 times in her kitchen on October 10, 2003. Prosecutors announced that they would seek the death penalty. This is in Florida, where they mean that shit, by the way, elevating the case to a capital prosecution. And with that, the investigation phase ended. What followed were pretrial battles over what the jury would be allowed to hear, how much of Tim's past could come in, and how the state would present a case built on forensics, timelines, and a staged lie. So that's where we go next.
Take us.
We're there. So by the time Tim Permenter's case reached trial, the investigative phase was over, and what mattered now was how each side would explain the same body of evidence to 12 jurors. There is no published transcript of jury selection, and we don't have voir dire questions or juror responses that have been preserved in the public record. What we do have from all kinds of coverage and later summaries is a clear picture of how both sides framed the case once the jury was seated. And those frames could not have been more different, because this was a capital first-degree murder case rooted in a domestic violence context. Jury selection would have focused on predictable fault lines. Prosecutors needed jurors who could accept that an intimate partner can kill over control and rejection, not just greed, strangers, or random violence. The defense, meanwhile, needed jurors who were wary of assuming guilt simply because the defendant was a boyfriend. That tension carried straight into opening statements. Once the jury was sworn, the state's case was presented as a staged domestic homicide, not a mystery, but a reconstruction. As we've already discussed, prosecutors built their theory from timelines, forensics, and behavior, arguing that Karen's attempt to leave the relationship triggered a violent response followed by deliberate misdirection. The prosecution emphasized escalation. Karen had recently learned about Tim's violent past. She was trying to end the relationship. She'd called 911 roughly 10 or 11 days before her death. At the same time, as the state highlighted, she was forward-looking, buying a new car, making plans, living independently. not unraveling or spiraling. From the state's perspective, this wasn't chaos, it was controlled slipping. Central to that framing was the stage scene theory that we discussed in part 1. Prosecutors told jurors they would hear expert testimony showing that Karen was likely incapacitated almost immediately, that she could not have stood and written on the wall, and that the word rock was written later over dried blood spatter in a right-handed stroke inconsistent with left-handed Karen. The message, the state argued, wasn't a dying declaration, it was a frame job. They then tied that staging directly to the timeline evidence. Jurors were told to expect testimony from the Pizza Hut delivery driver, cell tower experts, neighbors, and George Solomon, all pointing to Tim remaining at or near the villa during the critical hours, despite his claim that he had left early. As the prosecution framed it, Tim's shifting explanations about when he left and where he made the 9:32 p.m. phone call weren't innocent mistakes. They were consciousness of guilt. The defense approached the same evidence from the opposite direction. Rather than offering a competing narrative of who killed Karen, defense counsel focused on reasonable doubt and the dangers of a circumstantial case built around a defendant jurors might already dislike because he's a piece of shit. They reminded the jury that no murder weapon was ever recovered and that no one witnessed the stabbing itself. Much of the state's case, the defense argued, rested on interpretation, blood patterns, phone records, and expert opinions that could be debated. On the rock message, the defense counsel emphasized that no one actually saw the writing happen. They warned jurors against over-reliance on pattern analysis and suggested that alternative explanations, including confusion or unknown dynamics of the struggle, had been conclusively ruled out. With the cell tower evidence, the defense previewed challenges to how far signals can travel and how towers overlap, arguing that a call routing through a nearby tower did not, by itself, prove Tim was inside Karen's home at the moment of the killing. They also signaled an attack on George Solomon's credibility, pointing out that the alleged confession was unrecorded, disclosed later, and came from a witness whose own motives and timing could be questioned. Across openings and testimony, the defense urged jurors to see Tim as flawed, but not proven guilty. An imperfect boyfriend, yes, whose inconsistent memories were being recast as lies by a prosecution determined to make the evidence fit a single theory. In short, the jury was presented with two fundamentally different lenses. The state told them that this was an intimate partner murder disguised as something else, a frame job exposed by science and timelines. The defense told them that this was a circumstantial case built on interpretation, suspicion, and dislike, not proof beyond a reasonable doubt. And from that point forward, every witness, every expert, and every exhibit would be measured against those two competing stories. That's the terrain the jury was asked to navigate. So next, we move from framing to proof, witness by witness, starting with how the state established its timeline inside Karen Pannell's final hours. As we discussed earlier, one of the state's central claims was that the message written on the wall was staged. The medical examiner's testimony was critical to that argument because it addressed a simple but decisive question: what Karen Pannell's body could and could not physically do after the attack began. So at trial and in later summaries of the case, the medical examiner described Karen's injuries in detail. The findings were consistent across accounts and left little ambiguity about the severity of the assault. Karen was stabbed 16 times.
Damn.
The wounds were clustered primarily in the back and upper chest and neck area, a pattern consistent with sustained close-range attack rather than a single impulsive strike. A later post-conviction opinion noted that 4 of those stab wounds were independently fatal, meaning any one of them on its own could have caused her death. One injury in particular shaped the medical conclusions. The medical examiner identified a deep stab wound to Karen's back that partially severed her spinal cord. Forensic summaries later described the damage as extensive, in the range of near total disruption, which means pretty much severed the spinal cord.
Mm-hmm.
Medically, an injury of that magnitude would cause immediate or near immediate paralysis below the level of that wound, along with severe loss of trunk stability and motor control. I mean, you cut your spinal cord, you're paralyzed. It's that simple.
Yeah.
So in plain terms, this was not an injury that would allow someone to stand, balance, or rise from the floor in any kind of controlled way. She'd struggle to drag herself along.
Right.
The examiner testified that this spinal injury alone was incompatible with any kind of coordinated, purposeful movement, the kind of movement that would be required to get up, approach a wall, raise an arm, and deliberately write letters at shoulder height.
With the wrong hand.
With the wrong hand, exactly. The spinal damage was compounded by catastrophic chest injuries. Multiple stab wounds penetrated the chest, including wounds that damaged the heart and major blood vessels. The medical examiner explained that these injuries would have caused rapid and massive internal bleeding. Blood loss on that scale leads quickly to shock and death, not a prolonged period of functional activity. The state emphasized the combined effects of those injuries. Even if Karen had remained conscious briefly after the initial attack, the combination of the spinal cord disruption and the rapid blood loss would have stripped her of the strength, the coordination, and the stability that would be needed for any kind of deliberate action.
Physical and mental.
Absolutely. I mean, honestly, if she'd had a phone in her hand with these injuries, she probably could not have dialed 911.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how severe these injuries are. And I'm not saying anything everybody doesn't know. Like, you take a knife wound to the heart, you're done. Like, It's almost instantaneous. And, you sever the spinal cord, it is instant paralyzed. It's over, like, right now. So this simply was not a scenario involving minutes of mobility and decision-making abilities. It was a rapid psychological collapse. The likely sequence of the attack reinforced that conclusion. As summarized in all of the coverage that I've seen of this show, the medical and scene evidence supported an initial incapacitating stab from behind, followed by additional stabbing as Karen was either collapsing or already on the floor. Defensive wounds described across her body indicated that she fought at first, but once the spinal and chest injuries occurred, meaningful resistance and any kind of purposeful movement would have ended almost instantaneously.
Right.
The medical timeline also aligned with the blood evidence that we discussed earlier. Experts testified that the blood spatter already present on the wall would have taken roughly 20 minutes to dry. The word rock was written over those dried specks, not through wet blood. So that meant that the writing was added well after the main assault. The medical examiner was clear on the implication. Given the extent of Karen's spinal injuries and the severity of her internal bleeding, she could not have remained mobile and coordinated for that length of time. I mean, she couldn't have remained alive for that length of time.
Lazarus.
Right, yeah. This was not a victim who was going to be able to dip in her own blood and write on a wall. It just isn't going to happen. The mechanics simply don't work. A spinal injury that effectively transects most of the cord destroys motor and sensory pathways below that injury. Even limited arm movement above that level would have been compromised by extreme pain, blood loss, and cardiovascular collapse. Large, smooth, continuous strokes like those seen in the letters on the wall were medically implausible, if not totally impossible, under those conditions. So one additional detail, while more often discussed in the blood pattern testimony, dovetailed with the medical conclusions. As we already know, Karen was exclusively left-handed, yet her left hand did not show the kind of smeared or dragged blood one would expect, as if it had been used repeatedly to write on a wall. The absence was consistent with the medical examiner's conclusion that she was not physically capable of performing the act at all. So by the time the medical testimony concluded, the state had done more than argue that the writing was unlikely. They had presented a physiological impossibility. From a medical standpoint, Karen Pannell could not have stood up, approached a wall, and written a message after the attack began, let alone 20 minutes later, which meant the writing had to come from someone else. And that conclusion set the stage for the next witnesses, the forensic analysts, who would explain not just why Karen couldn't have written the message, but how it was written instead.
So was blood planted on her right hand? There's just no blood on either hand.
There was blood everywhere.
Okay.
But there's no indication on either hand that it had been repeatedly dipped in blood and written.
Okay.
So as we discussed in the previous segment, the medical examiner testified that Karen Pannell could not have physically stood up, written on the wall after the attack began. The bloodstain pattern analysis addressed the other half of that question, not what Karen's body could do, but what the wall itself revealed about when and how the word rock was written. So at trial, the state called a bloodstain pattern specialist who went by the name of Anna Cox, and her analysis focused on 3 core issues: layering, timing, and stroke characteristics. The work began with the wall itself. Investigators had a section of the kitchen sheetrock containing the word rock cut out and transported to the laboratory. Under magnification, Cox examined the individual impact spatters from the stabbing and the larger, smoother strokes that formed the letters. What she observed was not a single blended event. Fine impact spatter, tiny droplets created during the stabbing, were already present on the wall. The letter strokes forming rock passed cleanly over the tops of those droplets without smearing, breaking, or dragging them. That distinction mattered. In a true last act scenario where someone writes through fresh or tacky blood, the finger or the tool disturbs the underlying droplets. The tiny dots smear, they feather, or they wipe into the stroke. Here, the droplets remained intact beneath a separate continuous layer of blood. The only way that can happen is if the blood spatter has already dried. To determine how long that drying would take, Cox conducted controlled experiments. She recreated similar impact spatter on test panels in the lab and attempted to write over it at various time intervals using blood-coated fingers and tools. When she tried too early, while the spatter was still wet or tacky, the droplets smeared. They broke apart. The patterns changed. It wasn't until roughly 20 minutes had passed that the spatter remained intact when a blood-coated finger passed over it. So from those experiments, Cox concluded there was a minimum gap of about 20 minutes between the assault that created the spatter and the writing of rock. As we already know, that timing aligned directly with the medical examiner's testimony that Karen would have been paralyzed and rapidly dying during that window. Not upright, not mobile, not coordinated.
Or conscious.
And honestly, probably not alive. She'd probably bled out very quickly. So the analysts then turned to how the letters themselves were formed. Investigators had established that Karen was exclusively left-handed. As we've already discussed, her left hand did not show the kind of smeared, dragged blood pattern expected if it had been used to repeatedly write on the wall. Cox examined the shape and the flow of the letters, the direction of curves, how strokes began and tapered, and how corners and arcs were formed. Based on those characteristics, she concluded the writing was consistent with a right-handed stroke pattern. Conclusion did not stand alone. It fit with Karen's handedness and with the condition of her hands. The final question was whether the writing was done with a bare finger. At first glance, the message appeared finger-written. Karen's right index finger was heavily bloodstained, suggesting that it could have been used as a writing implement. But when Cox examined the letter strokes closely, she could not find ridge detail. no fingerprints embedded in the blood. That absence was significant. If a bare finger had written the letters, ridge detail would typically be visible. To test the alternative, Cox purchased a similar latex-type glove and conducted additional experiments. She coated a gloved finger in blood and wrote on test surfaces. The resulting strokes were smooth, continuous, and ridgeless, matching what she observed on the wall. Based on that testing, she concluded that Rock was likely written with a gloved hand, using Karen's blood and likely her finger as the brush. Taken together, the bloodstain analysis painted a coherent picture. The letters were written over fully dried spatter. They were added at least 20 minutes after the attack. They were formed with right-handed strokes. They were made with a gloved hand. And they were created at a point when, medically, Karen could not have been standing, coordinated, or alive in any meaningful way. In court, the state used this analysis to argue that Rock was not a dying declaration. It was staging, a deliberate post-homicide act meant to redirect suspicion toward a volatile ex-boyfriend and away from the person who had remained in and around the scene. And with the bloodstain evidence laid out, the focus of the trial shifted from the wall to the timeline and to the witnesses who placed Tim Permenter exactly where he said he wasn't. So the state's case did not rise or fall on a single piece of evidence. It was cumulative. And one of the most consequential layers in that acclamation came from the DNA analysis. Their testimony addressed a key defense theme head-on, the idea that Tim Permenter was merely a casual visitor earlier in the evening, not the person who carried out the attack. The DNA evidence told a totally different story. Investigators collected sublingual samples, scrapings, and tissue from beneath Karen Pannell's fingernails during the autopsy. Those samples are significant because they often capture skin cells transferred when a victim claws or grabs an attacker during a struggle. Forensic testing showed that those samples contained Tim Permenter's DNA. To further refine the finding, analysts conducted YSTR testing, which targets male-specific genetic markers. That testing again identified Tim as the contributor of the male DNA under her fingernails, reinforcing the material did not come from an unknown male or any kind of background contamination. In court, this was framed as a classic defensive injury DNA. Karen fought back, and in doing so, she took her attacker's skin with her. Post-conviction decisions later summarized the importance of this evidence plainly, noting that forensic analysts showed the victim had Tim's DNA under her fingernails. It was not treated as incidental, it was treated as central. The DNA findings did not stop there. Laboratory work on bloody items from the kitchen showed Tim's DNA mixed with Karen's blood in samples taken from all over the scene. That kind of mixture matters because it ties a person into the bloodletting event itself, not just into the home at some earlier unrelated time. As we've already talked about, prosecutors argued that this combination, defensive DNA under her nails plus mixed DNA and blood at the scene, was consistent with close, violent physical contact during the stabbing, not with a brief visit hours earlier. The state also pointed jurors to contextual evidence surrounding the final night. Tim's fingerprints and biological material were found on items associated with that evening, including the pizza box and beer containers, which contradicted his shifting account of when he'd left the home. That context mattered because it undercut attempts to isolate the DNA as something left behind long before the violence. Just as important as what the DNA showed was what it did not show. As we discussed earlier, investigators compared the same fingernail samples and scene evidence against Rock Herpich. His DNA was not found under Karen's nails. It was not found in the critical bloodstain mixtures, and his fingerprints were not found on the items associated with the final hours in the kitchen. Despite his name being written on the wall, nothing in the forensic record physically tied Rock to the stabbing. In court, analysts and investigators testified that the biological evidence pointed in only one direction. Multiple independent DNA findings tied Tim directly to Karen's body and to close quarters violence. None did the same for Rock, and that exclusion mattered. It was one of the reasons investigators cleared Rock and reinterpreted the word rock not as a clue left by Karen, but as part of a staged scene meant to redirect suspicion. By the time the DNA testimony concluded, the jury had heard 3 independent disciplines, medicine, bloodstain analysis, and genetics, all converging on the same conclusion. Karen could not have written on the wall. The writing was added later, and the biological evidence placed Tim, not Rock, in direct physical conflict with her at the moment that she was killed. With that foundation laid, the trial moved to the final pillar of the state's case, the timeline, and the witnesses who put Tim exactly where he said he wasn't. So where Tim Permenter actually was on the night that Karen Pannell was killed is one of the central disputes. The technical witnesses who addressed that question most directly was T-Mobile engineer Sean Sparks. Sparks was not offering theory or opinion in the abstract. He worked from Tim's own phone records. At trial, Sparks testified using T-Mobile's call detail records, which list timestamps for each call and identify the specific cell sites that handled the connection. And I'm like in this freaking world of cellular technology right now for a case that I'm working on. So I've learned that not only does it tell you like what tower it connected to, but it tells you like which sector of which tower, which sectors face in certain directions. So, I mean, it can really, and the case I'm working on was 2G technology. This was probably 2G as well, which isn't as great as it is now. But like this 5G shit, it's like, yeah, you are like right here.
Right here.
So anyway, so those records allowed him to place individual calls onto a physical map, not as a GPS pinpoint, but as a relationship between a phone and the network infrastructure that served it. So the most important call was one that was made at 9:32 p.m. to George Solomon. Tim had consistently claimed that this call was made while he was already driving north on US 19, well away from Oldsmar. Sparks walked the jury through why the records did not support this claim. Using tower maps, Sparks identified the cell site that handled the 9:32 p.m. call. The tower was located roughly 1/3 of a mile from Karen's townhouse on Montego Court. He physically mapped that site for the jury, showing that it served Karen's immediate neighborhood, not the highway corridor that Tim said that he was on. Sparks then explained how cell towers actually work. Each tower is divided into sectors, and apparently there's no rhyme or reason. Like some towers have 1 sector, some towers have 4 sectors. It's just like wherever they need the coverage is how it works. Yep. My brain had a real problem with that because I wanted it divided equally into 4 quadrants. It doesn't work that way.
No.
So anyway.
I'm sorry.
The sector that handled Tim's 9:32 call was oriented toward Karen's neighborhood, not towards US 19 several miles away. So based on that tower and sector orientation, Sparks testified that the call was likely made from near Karen Pannell's house. He quantified that distance as roughly 1/3 of a mile from the villa, close enough to place Tim squarely in the Oldsmar area in 9:32. Importantly, Sparks did not oversell his conclusion. He acknowledged the limitations of cell site analysis. Towers do not provide GPS coordinates. Coverage areas can overlap. A phone can sometimes connect from outside a narrow radius depending on the conditions. But he emphasized the key point for the jury: direction and proximity. The call did not route through a tower or sector associated with US 19. It routed through the closest neighborhood tower to Karen's home, in a sector aimed directly at her residential area. And that distinction matters. As the prosecution argued, The phone evidence didn't have to prove that Tim was standing inside the villa at 9:32. It only had to show that his claim of being miles away on a highway was inconsistent with the network data. Sparks' testimony did exactly that, and it had an immediate effect on the case. After Sparks explained the tower locations and sector orientation, Tim changed his story. On the stand, he conceded that the 9:32 call was not made from US 19 after all, but instead as he was leaving Karen's home.
Conveniently.
Yeah, and that shift mattered to the jury. Prosecutors used Sparks' maps and explanations to argue that Tim's alibi wasn't just mistaken, it was built on false geography. The phone records placed him essentially at the scene at 9:32, dovetailing with the Pizza Hut driver's placement of him at the house close to 9, and with neighbors who reported seeing his BMW at the townhouse later that night. Standing alone, cell tower data can feel abstract. In this case, it wasn't standing alone. It fit cleanly into a timeline that the state said Tim kept trying to outrun, and he couldn't. And with the technical evidence laid out, the jury turned next to the people who lived on Montego Court and what they saw as the night unfolded. So what ultimately mattered was how multiple strands of evidence came together: technical data, eyewitness accounts, and physical artifacts, who all were aligned into a single coherent timeline. So at trial, there was no separate law enforcement timeline analysis that was called to the stand. Instead, the work of tying everything together fell to the lead investigators from the Pannell County Sheriff's Office, working in tandem with the technical testimony from the T-Mobile engineer Sean Sparks. So Sparks provided the engineering layer: which tower handled which call, which sector was involved, and what that meant spatially. Detectives then overlaid that technical information with human observation and documented events and walked the jury through how the pieces fit together. The result was a stitched timeline built from 3 primary sources: the pizza delivery, Tim's phone records, and neighbor sightings of his BMW. Now, as we already know, the timeline begins with the pizza. So the Pizza Hut order, receipt, and the driver's testimony fixed Karen and Tim inside the townhouse at roughly 8:48 to 9 o'clock. The driver testified that Karen answered the door and that Tim was visible just inside the residence. That placement mattered because it established Tim's presence in the home much later than he originally claimed. The next anchor point came at 9:32. As we've already talked about, Tim placed a call to George Solomon at 9:32. Sean Sparks testified that that call hit a tower located roughly 1/3 of a mile from Karen's Montego Court address. In a sector oriented towards her neighborhood, detectives used that testimony to show that Tim's phone, and by extension Tim himself, was still in the Oldsmar area, not driving on US 19 as he'd initially told investigators. From there, the timeline extended forward through the night. Multiple neighbors testified that they saw Tim's BMW parked at the townhouse complex at various points: around 10 p.m., again around 2 a.m., and once more around 5 a.m. Those sightings suggested not a single early departure, but repeated or prolonged presence at the location throughout the night. Detectives then bracketed those events with the final call that mattered. At approximately 10:30 a.m. on Saturday, Tim called 911 and reported that he had, quote, found Karen dead in her home. That call marked the outer end of the window and framed his discovery narrative against everything the jury had already heard about the previous night. Presented together, the sequence looked like this: pizza delivered just before 9 p.m., with Tim present in the home. At 9:32, phone call placed from near Karen's neighborhood. A BMW seen at the complex late into the night and early morning hours, and a 911 call the next day reporting the body. There was no mystery about how this was shown to the jury. Prosecutors and detectives used charts and boards in the courtroom to align the timestamps, the tower maps, and the witness observations side by side. The goal was not to overwhelm the jury with data, but to make the inconsistencies visible. And those inconsistencies all pointed in the same direction. Tim's timeline, leaving by 7:30, driving north, being gone for hours, did not match the composite picture created by receipts, records, and eyewitnesses. That mattered not because any one piece proved guilt, but because all of them told the same story. In later post-conviction review, federal courts explicitly noted that the jury heard evidence about inconsistencies between the timeline that Tim gave law enforcement and where cellular records placed him, confirming that this composite, law enforcement-driven timeline was a central part of the state's proof. So by the time the timeline evidence concluded, the jury wasn't being asked to choose between competing guesses. They were being shown how independent sources, human, technical, and physical, all converged on the same window of time. And with that framework in place, the trial moved to the witness who, according to the state, tied that timeline to intent and staging, George Solomon. After days of expert testimony about blood, DNA, and cell towers, the jury heard from a civilian witness whose role in the case was almost mundane, and precisely because of that, powerful. And that was the Pizza Hut driver. So as we've already talked about, one of the state's challenges was anchoring a complex forensic and technical case to something simple and human. The delivery did exactly that. At trial, the driver was identified as Richard Davis, a Pizza Hut employee who delivered an order to 2030 Montego Court on the night of October 10, 2003. Davis testified that when he arrived, Karen Pannell answered the door. They spoke casually in the doorway for several minutes, the kind of brief, ordinary interaction that usually fades from memory. But during that exchange, Davis could see Tim Permenter inside the home. And that detail mattered. It placed him physically in the house at the same time that Karen was alive and interacting normally with someone outside of the household. And it directly contradicted his repeated claim that he had left the home by about 7:30 and did not return. Davis recalled Tim scowling at him from inside the residence. Prosecutors used that observation not as proof of guilt, but as context, suggesting irritation or possessiveness rather than a relaxed, friendly visit. The timing of the delivery was critical. In appellate opinions and news summaries, Davis consistently placed the delivery at, quote, around 9 p.m. The prosecution locked that estimate down by pairing his testimony with Pizza Hut store records and the delivery receipt, which fixed the order and delivery window between approximately 8:48 and 9 o'clock. And that window came well after the 7:30 departure time that Tim initially gave detectives. A federal habeas decision later summarized the importance of this testimony directly, noting that Davis testified that he had seen Tim inside the victim's home when he delivered the pizza around 9 p.m., evidence that totally contradicted Tim's account of having already left. Defense counsel did what defense counsel is expected to do. They focused on the usual pressure points. How many deliveries did Davis make that night? Whether he could be confusing one stop with another stop, and how confident he really was about the time and about Tim's presence inside the home. And those questions mattered. If Davis was wrong about the time or mistaken about who he saw, then Tim's 7:30 narrative might still hold. But Davis's account didn't stand alone. His memory was anchored by independent business records, ticket time, delivery address, and store logs, which gave his estimate objective support rather than relying solely on recollection years later. And this wasn't just any delivery. It became memorable precisely because it was later identified as Karen's last known normal interaction, and because police returned to Davis after the murder to ask detailed questions about that specific night at that specific address. When appellate courts later reviewed the case, they treated Davis's testimony as solid enough to cite alongside the cell tower evidence and George Solomon's account as key contradictions to Tim's version of events. And that matters. Courts do not rely on testimony that they view as significantly impeached or unreliable when summarizing why a jury's verdict will stand. So in the end, the pizza delivery did not prove who killed Karen. What it did was narrower and just as important. It fixed a moment in time. Karen was alive, Tim was inside the home, and it was happening well after he said he was gone. From there, the jury heard from the neighbors, people who lived on Montego Court and noticed a BMW that seemed to keep coming back. So after the pizza delivery had fixed Tim inside Karen's home around 9, the state turned to the people who lived on Montego Court, neighbors whose testimony filled in what happened after that point. 3 different residents, independent of one another, placed the same blue BMW convertible at or near Karen's driveway at 3 separate points during the night and early morning. Like I've said, around 10, around 2 a.m., and 2:30 a.m., and again at 5 and 5:30 a.m. So taken together, their accounts described not a brief visit, but a prolonged presence. The first of those witnesses was Casey Miller. Miller was Karen's next-door neighbor. They shared a driveway on Montego Court, and he testified that when he arrived home on the night of October 10th, he got in no earlier than 10:10 p.m., and immediately had trouble pulling into the driveway. And that's one that'll lock in your memory. Because if you come home and you can't get in your driveway, you are instantly pissed off, and you're going to remember that shit. I guarantee it. Yep. I've been in that situation.
Yep, you're in my spot.
Yes. So a blue BMW convertible was parked crookedly across the shared drive, blocking his access.
Oh.
So he was pissed, and he's going to remember that shit. And he's going to have an axe to grind, so Tim's going down, man. So
park your BMW wherever.
I'll teach you, you son of a bitch. So Miller testified that he had to maneuver around the vehicle to park, placing him within inches of it, stationary in his own driveway. He identified the car as Tim's BMW. Later, law enforcement testimony confirmed that all 3 neighbor witnesses were describing the same vehicle. From an evidentiary standpoint, Miller's observation carried weight because of proximity. This was not a fleeting glance from a distance or a guess made in poor lighting. He was physically interacting with the obstruction in a space that he used every day.
Yeah.
Misidentification under those circumstances is very unlikely. The second witness, and you couple that with the fact that Tim is Karen's boyfriend, albeit ex or not, that car has been there before. So he's probably like, oh, this son of a bitch that always parks crooked, always freaking blocks my drive. Yeah, he knew that car.
Arrogant BMW asshole.
Yeah.
I just had to throw in my 2 cents.
Well, I agree. So the second witness moved the timeline forward several hours. Mikkel Fincher lived directly across the street from Karen's villa. She worked as a bartender and testified that she and her boyfriend arrived home around 2 a.m. When they pulled up, she noticed Tim's BMW parked across the street near Karen's home. Her testimony didn't stop there. Fincher stated that she saw the BMW again about a half an hour later, around 2:30 a.m., when she let her dog outside. The car was still there, unchanged. As with Miller, there were no reported issues with distance or visibility. Fincher was observing from her own property across a residential street that she knew well at close range. Her overnight work schedule made a 2 a.m. arrival unremarkable for her, and it reduced the likelihood of confusion about the timing. The final neighbor witness carried the BMW into the early morning hours. Mark Stouffer lived on Dover Court, the next street to the south, which runs parallel to Montego Court. His regular morning routine involved walking his poodle past Karen's front door. Between 5 and 5:30 a.m. on October 11th, Stouffer testified that as he passed Karen's villa, his dog abruptly pulled toward the bushes near her front door and refused to continue, a break from its normal behavior. As Stouffer picked up the dog and turned away, he physically bumped into a car parked behind Karen's Volkswagen. He described it as a BMW convertible with the top down. That detail stood out to him. It was early morning, and leaving the top down struck him as unusual. Like Miller, Stouffer was not identifying a car from a distance. He made physical contact with it and then observed it closely enough to note the model and the open top. Although it was pre-dawn, it was not pitch black. Street and exterior lights were present, and nothing in the reporting suggests lighting or distance issues that would undermine any kind of identification. So when viewed individually, each of these sightings might seem modest, but together they form a sequence. Miller anchored the BMW at the driveway around 10 o'clock. Fincher placed it there again at 2 and at 2:30, and Stouffer encountered it still there around dawn, parked behind Karen's car. There were minor variations in exact times, the normal range that you would expect from human witnesses recalling different moments of the same night, but there were no material conflicts in substance. The accounts reinforced one another rather than competing. All three witnesses described the same distinctive vehicle. All three placed it at or immediately adjacent to Karen's home, and all three observations contradicted Tim's claim that he left around 7:30 and did not return until late the next morning. In the post-conviction review, federal courts specifically noted that the jury heard this eyewitness vehicle evidence, independent of phone records, as part of the proof that Tim's timeline didn't hold up. And that matters because even without cell phone tower maps or forensic charts, the neighbors told a simple story. A blue BMW that should not have been there kept showing up, hour after hour, outside a home where a woman lay dead inside. And with the civilian witnesses accounted for, the trial turned to the one non-expert witness the state said connected the timeline to intent. That was George Solomon. And I just got to say that with these eyewitnesses, it's not as though they were like out at a bar one night or something. They were in their neighborhood going through their normal routines. And that makes a huge difference because, dog owners, typically you're getting up at the same time, you're walking your dog, everything's the same. And so when something happens that's outside of that normal, it sticks with you.
Yeah.
And, dogs are amazing. A dog sensing something's not right in that house, it doesn't surprise me at all. And honestly, the dog probably speaks more to me than all eyewitnesses together. It's like, I trust that dog. He knows. So up to this point, the state's case has been built from science, timelines, and observations. What it still needed was a window into Tim Permenter's state of mind, something that connected the physical evidence to intent. And that connection came through George Solomon. George testified that on the night that Karen Pannell was killed, he was in Newport Richey at the home of his girlfriend, Vicky Speakman. He told the jury that he received a call from Tim around 10:30 p.m., not because George had invited him over, but because Tim said that he needed to talk in person. They agreed to meet at a gas station nearby. When Tim arrived, George testified that his demeanor immediately stood out. He described Tim as, quote, shaky, very shaky. He wasn't calm. He was not relaxed. He was visibly agitated and upset. George told the jury that he tried to keep Tim calm and suggested that if he needed time to think, he could follow him back to the house. But before that happened, the conversation turned to something else, an alibi. George testified that Tim asked him to help explain where he had been that night, to say that he had been with George longer than he actually had been. In other words, to help construct a version of events that placed Tim away from Oldsmar during the critical window. Prosecutors framed that request as consciousness of guilt. Tim understood he needed distance from the scene, and he was asking a friend to help him manufacture it. Then, according to George, Tim confessed. On the stand, George testified that Tim told him directly that he had killed Karen. He said Tim explained that there'd been an argument tied in George's account to Tim having quit his job and that he had used a knife. Most significantly, George testified that Tim told him that he had used Karen's finger to write the name of her ex-boyfriend on the wall, to write Rock in blood. George also told the jury that the confession didn't end at the gas station. He testified that Tim followed him back to Vicky's house and that on the enclosed front porch, Tim repeated the admission, again stating that he had killed Karen. Vicky Speakman's testimony was more limited. She confirmed that she had not invited Tim over and that she barely knew him, contradicting Tim's suggestion that he had been welcomed to Newport Richey as part of a friendly visit. She told the courts that she did not listen in on the private porch conversation between George and Tim and therefore did not hear a confession herself. Her role was contextual, not corroborative, or not corroborative of the exact words. During cross-examination, defense counsel pressed that point. They suggested that if Vicky denied any porch confession, it would directly contradict George. George responded bluntly that if she said there was no such confession, she would be lying, underscoring his insistence that the encounter occurred just as he described it. The defense then went after credibility. They emphasized that George did not immediately report the confession. He did not fully disclose it until years later, in April, after initially serving as an alibi witness for Tim. The defense framed this as a damaging delay, suggesting the story evolved over time. They argued that George had motive to lie. He had initially helped Tim. Later, he changed his account and became the state's key witness. Defense counsel suggested that he did so to protect himself from scrutiny, to curry favor with law enforcement, or to distance himself from Tim as the investigation closed in. They also attacked the plausibility of the story itself. The defense mocked the idea that someone would confess to murder and then be invited into a house with a girlfriend and children. Portraying the porch scene is inherently unbelievable. And by pointing out that Vicky did not hear the confession, they argued that George's account was uncorroborated and possibly embellished. Finally, they raised issues of memory and intoxication. It was late at night. People had been drinking. Years passed before George gave a full account. Defense counsel suggested that specific phrases like, "I killed Karen," "used her finger," could be the product of hindsight or suggestive questioning rather than Tim's actual words. The jury heard all of it. They also heard where George's testimony fit. It did not stand alone. It matched the staging evidence on the wall. It matched the medical testimony about incapacitation. It matched the bloodstain analysis. It matched the cell tower data. It matched the pizza delivery and the neighbor sightings of Tim's BMW. In later post-conviction review, courts explicitly noted that George Solomon's testimony, including Tim's shaky demeanor, the request to be covered for, and the admission about using Karen's finger to write rock, was a central pillar of the state's case. They did not find the defense's credibility attacks sufficient to undermine the verdict. For the jury, George's account provided the connective tissue. It explained why the science looked the way it did, and it gave voice to what the state argued was already written, not just on the wall, but across the evidence itself. So the word written on the kitchen wall shaped everything that followed, and the detectives who took the stand did not try to minimize that fact. They acknowledged it. When deputies first entered Karen's kitchen and saw the word rock written in blood, their focus immediately turned to Karen's ex-boyfriend, Rock Herpich. His name matched the letters. He had a volatile history with Karen. There had been prior domestic violence calls, and at first glance, the scene looked like a dying declaration pointing straight at him. Lead Detective Michael Holbrook and his partner described Rock as the initial primary suspect. From their perspective, this was the logical starting point. You don't ignore a name written in blood. Tim Permenter reinforced that focus during his interviews. He told detectives that Karen had a, quote, rocky relationship with an ex named Rock, further feeding the assumption that the writing on the wall was genuine. But the detectives testified that assumptions only last until they're tested. The day after Karen's body was found, investigators drove to Rock's home near Port Charlotte and conducted a lengthy and detailed interview. Rock and his girlfriend were separated for questioning. Detectives photographed the bottoms of Rock's feet and took fingernail clippings, looking for trace evidence, blood, tissue, anything that could link him physically to the stabbing. They also walked through Rock's prior history with Karen, including earlier confrontations, the door-kicking incident, and the unresolved dispute over a roll-top desk. None of that was ignored. Rock and his girlfriend both told detectives that on the night of the murder, they were at home. Her young son was hosting a backyard campout with several other boys, creating multiple independent alibi witnesses. Detectives interviewed those witnesses and documented their accounts. As forensic results came back, the case against Rock continued to erode. There was no DNA tying him to Karen's body, no material under her fingernails, no fingerprints, no biological evidence linking him to the kitchen or the bloodletting. Nothing in the scene placed him there. With a corroborated alibi and no physical evidence, detectives testified that Rock was cleared as a suspect, despite his name being written on the wall. The decision was not framed as reluctance, it was framed as obligation. And at the same time, the forensic picture began forcing a deeper reassessment of the scene itself. As we already know, crime scene analyst Anna Cox told detectives that under magnification, the letters Rock sat on top of already dried blood spatter. Her lab work and drying experiments showed that the spatter would have needed roughly 20 minutes to dry to remain undisturbed beneath the letter strokes. Investigators also learned that Karen was exclusively left-handed, while the writing showed a right-handed stroke, and her left hand lacked the smearing that you would expect if she had written the message. Coupled with the medical examiner's opinion that Karen would have been paralyzed and rapidly dying after the initial back and chest wounds, detectives testified that the meaning of Rock changed. What had first appeared to be a dying declaration now looked like a staged message added after Karen was already incapacitated and likely dead. And that was the pivot point. In court and in later interviews, Holbrook and his colleagues emphasized that the case began with Rock because of the wall writing, but it shifted the moment objective checks failed to support his involvement. They described a methodical process identifying logical suspects from the scene, Rock from the writing, Tim as the current boyfriend, Karen's ex-husband, and even a vague burglary theory. Test each against alibis, forensic evidence, and behavior, and clear them when the evidence didn't fit. Detectives testified that they cleared all of Tim Permenter's intended patsies, Rock, the ex-husband, and the phantom burglar, because each had either strong alibis or no physical connection to the crime. Holbrook later told Dateline that once Cox demonstrated the writing was added after the dried blood, Rock flipped from a clue to evidence of staging, and that was when the focus settled fully on Tim. The tunnel vision critique was not ignored. In court and later in media coverage, investigators addressed it directly. They acknowledged the early Rock focus and then walked the jury through exactly how and why they backed out of it. They emphasized that Rock was not cleared on instinct or out of sympathy. He was fully investigated, interviewed, physically examined, checked against forensic results, and tested against multiple independent alibi witnesses. They also emphasized that multiple theories were pursued in parallel, not sequentially abandoned until one stuck. Only when the forensic and the timeline evidence converged did the case narrow. When evidence contradicted the initial assumption, no Rock DNA, a solid alibi, and clear indicators of staging, Detectives testified that they changed their theory instead of forcing the evidence to fit it. It's been noted that this pivot was one reason the case does not read like a classic tunnel vision wrongful conviction story. The person the bloody wall seemed to accuse was ultimately excluded, and the case was rebuilt around timeline, science, and a confession pointing elsewhere. By the time the detectives finished their testimony, the jury had been shown not just who investigators believe killed Karen, but how they got there. And with the investigation fully laid out, the trial moved into its final phase. The defense case and Tim Permenter's decision to take the stand himself.
Smarty pants.
Yeah, that never goes well.
Mm-mm.
The state did not present motive as a vague claim about a troubled relationship. Instead, prosecutors anchored it to a specific moment, a law enforcement interaction that occurred roughly 10 or 11 days before Karen was killed. That moment came through the testimony of a deputy who responded to a domestic-type call at Karen's townhouse. Accounts vary slightly on whether the call was logged as a welfare check or as a disturbance, but the essential facts were not in dispute. Uniformed deputies were at Karen's home. Tim Permenter was present, and law enforcement ran his information. When the deputy ran Tim's name, his criminal history came back immediately, including a serious prior case involving attempted murder, kidnapping, shooting into an occupied dwelling, and armed burglary, along with other violent and exploitation-related offenses tied to his past as a pimp.
What a peach.
Yeah.
That's your favorite saying.
Boy. So according to trial testimony, the deputy then warned Karen directly. He told her that Tim had done significant prison time, that his past was violent, and that she needed to take that information seriously. And that really speaks to Karen's personality.
Mm-hmm.
You don't have to be a fly on the wall to know. This deputy was like, this woman is like, a pillar of the community. You could tell she's responsible.
Yeah. What is she doing with
she doesn't know this.
Yeah.
I've got to tell her. So, and this was not a friend's opinion or a secondhand rumor. It was a uniformed deputy standing in her home telling her the truth about the man that she was dating.
It had to be a gut punch.
Oh, God, I can't even imagine. So the state argued that this warning changed everything. Friends, family members, and coworkers later told investigators that Karen had not known the full extent of Tim's record before that night. And according to them, Tim had given her a minimized, sanitized version of his past.
Of course he did.
Of course he did. So after the deputy's warning, Karen began confiding in people about what she'd learned. A coworker, Catherine Mallett, later described Karen as shaken and disturbed by the revelation. Catherine also testified that Karen once wore a turtleneck on a hot day and briefly showed marks on her neck from an earlier choking incident. Testimony the state used to tie the warning to escalating fear rather than abstract concern. And from that point forward, prosecutors argued Karen was trying to get out. She was pulling back, setting boundaries, telling people that she wanted to end the relationship. And in the state's narrative, this was the critical pre-homicide shift. The moment Karen gained clarity about who Tim really was, and the moment his control began to slip. At trial, the deputy's testimony served three distinct purposes. First, knowledge. It established that Karen knew about Tim's violent past before she was killed, undercutting any suggestion that she remained unaware or accepting of it. Second, conflict. It provided a concrete trigger for escalation. Once Karen knew, the relationship changed, and the state argued that change enraged Tim, especially as he was also quitting his job and losing other sources of stability. And third, pattern. Prosecutors framed this as fitting a well-documented intimate partner homicide pattern, a woman entering the exit ramp phase after discovering the truth, and a man with a history of violence responding to rejection with lethal force. The state wove this testimony back into its broader narrative, The deputy's warning became the spark. Karen's attempt to leave became the threat. And the killing, prosecutors argued, followed directly from the loss of control, culminating in the argument, the stabbing, and the staged rock meant to deflect blame. The defense, however, was keenly aware of the danger this evidence posed, because the deputy's testimony touched Tim's prior bad acts. It intersected with pretrial rulings that limited how much of his criminal history the jury could hear. The court initially kept many specifics out to avoid improper propensity evidence, convicting someone because of who they were, not what they did in this case. So that balance became delicate when Tim later testified and suggested that Karen had lied to deputies during the earlier incident. At that point, the judge briefly sent the jury out to consider whether Tim had, quote, opened the door to more details about the prior call and his background. Even with those limits in place, the core fact remained uncontested. A deputy with no personal stake warned Karen about Tim's violent past days before she was killed. The state used that uncontroverted moment to anchor motive in something tangible, not generic relationship turmoil, but a documented turning point where Karen learned the truth and tried to get away. And with motive, opportunity, and evidence all on the table, the trial moved toward its final act, the defense case and Tim Permenter's decision to speak for himself. So when the defense case began, one thing became immediately clear. The strategy was not to fight the state's science with competing science. There was no indication in the trial record, appellate opinions, or post-conviction review that the defense called its own experts to challenge bloodstain pattern analysis, DNA testing, or cell tower methodology. Instead, defense counsel chose a different approach: cross-examination and argument. So rather than present alternative expert narratives, the defense focused on highlighting the limits of each discipline and reminding the jury that even strong forensic evidence can still be circumstantial. That approach played out across each technical area, starting with bloodstain pattern analysis. As we've already talked about, the state relied heavily upon the expert testimony about the writing on the wall and all of that kind of stuff. The defense did not present a competing bloodstain expert offering a different timing or staging theory. Instead, counsel challenged the expert through cross-examination. They asked whether anything in science could absolutely exclude hands or fingers from writing the letters. They acknowledged, as experts often do, that science rarely deals in absolutes. Nothing is 100%, but they reiterated, in their professional opinion, it was highly unlikely that Karen wrote the message. That exchange became representative of the defense posture. Rather than refuting the analysis, they emphasized uncertainty. And then the other forensic findings, Tim's DNA under Karen's fingernails and mixed with her blood at the scene, appear in the record as uncontested laboratory results. Nothing indicate that the defense offered any sort of DNA experts or anything like that, and instead they argued just an innocent transfer of DNA. They suggested that the DNA could have been deposited any time under her fingernails. So, and then the approach to the cell tower evidence followed the exact same template. They cross-examined the expert Sparks about range, overlap, precision. They emphasized cell site analysis could not provide GPS coordinates and that coverage areas can extend beyond a single street. But again, they did not present a competing expert. They just tried to tear the experts apart. Yeah, so, and they did not attempt to replace the state's science with any kind of different scientific explanation. Instead, they just aimed to tear it apart or to soften it.
Yeah.
They questioned interpretation. They highlighted limitations. They offered alternative, non-criminal explanations for incriminating results. And they returned repeatedly to the idea that the case, even with expert testimony, remained only circumstantial. No murder weapon, no eyewitness, no video. The defense asked the jury to accept the possibility that Even if experts were correct in their methods, the conclusions drawn from those methods did not rise to proof beyond a reasonable doubt. The strategy set the stage for the most important defense witness of all, Emmy Boy himself, and for the final arguments about whether uncertainty was enough to overcome the weight of evidence. So one thing the defense did not do in this case was present a fully formed alternative theory of how Karen died. There was no formal rough sex defense. There was no detailed unknown assailant narrative, and there was no competing reconstruction of the crime scene offered through defense experts. Instead, the defense strategy worked on the margins by introducing doubt through timing, interpretation, unanswered questions, and asking jurors to decide whether those doubts were reasonable in light of the evidence.
Who in the world is getting stabbed 16 times in a rough sex defense?
Right? Yeah, I know.
I need to know.
Yeah.
Who's getting stabbed once? Because I need to know that too.
Well, ironically enough, there is a case
of course,
where these two gay guys, part of their sexual practices was to stab each other with like forks and shit. And apparently,
like a pain thing?
Yeah.
Okay.
And like the one guy got carried away and the other guy bled out. And
yikes.
So it's a thing. I mean, I don't know about the stabbing through the spinal cord part, but
yeah,
it is apparently a thing where people they stab each other with forks, like kitchen forks, not like the cooking forks, but like,
right.
Yeah, you could see these prong marks all over this guy's chest from this sexual experience with his lover. And then he ended up killing his lover. So I don't know, this whole other story.
Okay.
But to answer your question, it's a thing.
I'm kind of sorry I asked. Not 100% sorry I asked.
So in his initial statements to detectives, Tim claimed that he left around 7:30. He was on Highway 19, headed north by 9:32 when he talked to George, all that. And we talked about the cell phone experts, but on the stand, Tim conceded that the 9:32 call was actually made as he was leaving Karen's home, not while driving miles away. Even then, he maintained that he left her alive and did not return until the following morning when he said that he discovered her body. Jurors were asked to evaluate that claim against the rest of the record. They heard from the pizza driver. They heard from the cell tower expert. They heard from the three neighbors independently placing his BMW there. And the state argued that once those pieces were aligned, there was no realistic window for an unknown assailant to arrive, kill Karen, stage the scene, and leave, all without leaving any trace of evidence or being seen. And I gotta say, I didn't see this reported anywhere, but the fact that he wrote her ex-boyfriend's name on the wall kind of ties it to somebody that knew Karen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Now it cannot be an unknown assailant.
Yeah.
It has to be somebody with an intimate knowledge of Karen. It can't be somebody she just met. It has to be somebody
who just happens to know.
That knows her history. So really, he screwed himself by putting that shit on the wall. So the state was tying the forensics to the medical findings, the 16 stab wounds, the defensive injuries, the near transection of the spinal cord, multiple independently fatal chest wounds. And they argued that while a consensual act might explain trace DNA in some cases, it could not explain the pattern, the volume, and the placement of injuries here, nor could it account for defensive DNA under the fingernails in the context of a sustained stabbing. And as for alternative suspects, the defense could not seriously resurrect Rock Herpage as a viable killer. His alibi was solid. There was no Rock DNA, no fingerprints. Rock didn't do it.
Rock didn't do it.
Even so, defense counsel worked to keep the idea of someone else alive, an unidentified intruder, investigative tunnel vision, or an incomplete reconstruction without committing to any one alternative explanation. The prosecution obviously countered that. I mean, the evidence is freaking clear. So Dipshit's decision to take the stand was the defense's last and most consequential move. So by the time he testified, the state had already built a tight forensic and timeline case around him. His testimony was not about offering a new explanation of what happened inside the home. It was about trying to explain away the contradictions, especially the timeline and the alleged confession, and asking jurors to see those problems as human error rather than evidence of guilt. So he testified, obviously, that he did not kill Karen. He told jurors they argued that he left her alive and that he returned the next morning and found her body. He flatly denied ever confessing to George Solomon. He denied saying, "I killed Karen," and he denied admitting to using her finger to write rock on the wall. In his telling, the gas station meeting in Newport Richey never involved a confession at all. He claimed he simply arrived, said little, and followed George back to the house, a version that stood in direct conflict with George's account of a shaken, agitated Tim asking for help and admitting what he'd done. During his testimony, Tim also volunteered that Karen had lied to a deputy during a 911 call roughly 10 days before her death, and that statement immediately raised alarms. So like I said before, the judge sent the jury out while prosecutors argued that Tim had opened the door to the details of his the prior domestic incident and to the aspects of his criminal history that had been kept from the jury. And after discussion, the state agreed not to introduce the full 911 call content, but the moment mattered. It allowed prosecutors later to argue that Tim was attacking Karen's credibility in open court when she could no longer answer back. On the timeline, the most damaging part of the state's case, Tim conceded ground. He admitted that he had been wrong about when he'd left Karen's house. I mean, I said 7:30. It was really
it's
2 o'clock the next morning. So he had left by 7:30 and made the 9:32 call to George while driving on US 19. That was all incorrect. It was just a mistake. And instead, he told jurors that he believed the 9:32 call was made as he was leaving Karen's home. When pressed by prosecutor Bill Lawfrey on whether being wrong about times made him a murderer, Tim tried to flip the logic back on the state. Does that make me a murderer? He framed his errors as innocent imprecision, not deception. He also tried to explain inconsistencies in his earlier descriptions of the scene, including saying that Karen might have been, quote, shot or stabbed, even as prosecutors highlighted that some of the details that he claimed to have observed were not visible from where he said that he stood when he found her. The confrontation peaked when Lawfrey reminded the jury that Karen was not alive to defend herself against Tim's claims about her honesty. Quote, "You know better than anyone else in this courtroom that Karen is not here to defend herself," he said, and then he put the accusation directly to Tim. Quote, "You shut her mouth on October 10th, didn't you?" Tim answered, "No, sir, I did not." That denial, delivered face-to-face, became the fulcrum of the case. Jurors were left to decide whether they believed him or if they believed the evidence that stacked against him. In closing arguments, the state returned to consistency, not in Tim's story, but in the evidence. Prosecutors walked jurors back through the timeline that they'd built piece by piece: the pizza delivery, the cell towers, the neighbors, the DNA under Karen's fingernails, the medical and the bloodstain evidence, George Solomon's testimony, and the state argued that Tim's shifting explanations were not random mistakes, but conscious attempts to push himself away from the moment that Karen was killed. They told jurors that this was not a puzzle with missing pieces. It was a complete story of an intimate partner murder followed by staging. They also emphasized that Tim's attack on Karen's credibility from the stand was part of the same pattern: control of the narrative, even after her death. The defense closed with a different lens, obviously. Defense attorney Dudley Clapp urged jurors not to confuse inconsistency with guilt. He argued, just because he's lying doesn't mean he did anything wrong. That's not really what he said. That was me. So he argued that being wrong about times, especially years later, does not make someone a killer. He asked jurors to see Tim's errors as ordinary human fallibility, not consciousness of guilt, because, gosh, almost everybody trips and falls and gets up as a pimp that tries to, the jury wasn't allowed to hear that shit.
Yeah.
So Clapp focused heavily on George Solomon, attacking the delayed disclosure of the confession, the late night circumstances, the drinking, and the implausibility of someone confessing to murder and then being welcomed into a home with children. He reminded jurors that Vicky Speakman did not hear the confession, leaving George as the lone source of that claim. On the science, the defense emphasized limits. Bloodstain analysis is opinion. Cell tower gives ranges, not dots. And DNA under fingernails can have innocent explanations in a romantic relationship. And they reminded jurors there was no murder weapon, no eyewitness to the stabbing, and no recorded confession from Tim himself. And finally, they asked jurors to consider Tim's decision to testify, to face questioning and admit his mistakes as evidence that he was trying to explain, not to hide. So by the time the arguments ended, the case had narrowed to a single question. Was Tim Permenter's explanations enough to create reasonable doubt? Or did they simply show a man trying and failing to talk his way out of a forensic and timeline box that he had built for himself? That question was left to the jury. After the testimony ended and closing arguments were complete, the case went to the jury. On October the 24th, 2007, a Pinellas County jury found Tim Permenter guilty of first-degree murder in the stabbing death of Karen Pannell. There were no accounts of a hung jury, no notes signaling deadlock, no suggestion that jurors struggled to reach a verdict on guilt. After roughly a week-long trial, the jury convicted him outright. The conviction encompassed premeditated first-degree murder, with the state having argued aggravating factors based on the nature of the attack itself. 16 stab wounds, a prolonged and brutal assault, and the deliberate staging of the crime scene afterward. The case then moved into the penalty phase. At sentencing, the jury heard additional evidence, including mitigation presented by the defense. A forensic psychologist testified that Tim was under extreme emotional disturbances at the time, and that his ability to conform his conduct to the law was substantially impaired. He just couldn't follow the law.
I just can't do what's right.
That's what happens when pimps lose their job. So the state countered with the brutality of the crime and the calculated nature of what followed it. After hearing that evidence,
you couldn't see yourself.
No, I could not see myself. So after hearing that evidence, the jury voted 7-5 to recommend the death penalty. Now, under Florida law at the time, that recommendation was advisory. It was not binding. Circuit Judge R. Timothy Peters ultimately rejected the death recommendation and sentenced Tim Permenter to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In imposing that sentence, the court still accepted the state's characterization of the crime as especially cruel and deliberate. The number and the placement of the stab wounds, the slow, violent nature of Karen's death, the fact that Rock was written in blood as a staged effort to frame another man. The judge weighed those aggravating factors against mitigation, including the mental health bullshit and Tim's background as a pimp, and concluded that life without parole was the appropriate sentence. Tim would die in prison, but without the state seeking to carry out the death sentence. During sentencing, Karen's family spoke. Her stepmother, Yvonne Pannell, and her brother, Mike Pannell, described the pain of learning how Karen died and sitting through days of graphic testimony about her final moments. Yvonne told reporters that whatever sentence Tim received, he would never experience what he'd put Karen through. A quiet evening in her home turning into a violent death on her kitchen floor. Mike spoke about the emotional cost of the trial, saying the family had to balance reliving the worst night of Karen's life with preserving who she was beyond the crime, her independence, her kindness, and the life that she'd been building. Those statements anchored the case back to its center, a real person whose life ended violently, not just a file of forensic exhibits. After sentencing, obviously, Tim appealed.
Surprise, surprise.
On direct appeal to Florida's 2nd District Court of Appeal, he argued that the evidence was insufficient to support first-degree murder. The trial court should have granted a judgment of acquittal, that a mistrial should have been declared after a brief reference to his past criminal history, which he made, and the court erred in denying a continuance when defense counsel became ill. The appellate court rejected those arguments and affirmed the conviction and life sentence. Tim then sought federal habeas relief, again challenging the sufficiency of the evidence and the handling of the evidentiary issues at trial. The federal court denied relief. In its ruling, the court held that a rational jury could find premeditated first-degree murder beyond a reasonable doubt based on the totality of the evidence, the medical findings, the staged rock message, the bloodstain analysis, the cell tower testimony, the timeline built from witnesses, the DNA under Karen's nails, and George Solomon's account of Tim's confession. The court also noted that some of Tim's claims were procedurally barred because they had been raised only as state law issues, not as federal constitutional violations. Neither the admission of the cell evidence nor the handling of references to Tim's criminal history was found to constitute a reversible error. No court, state or federal, concluded that the evidence was legally insufficient or that the trial was fundamentally unfair. Today, this total freaking asshat remains incarcerated in Florida, serving life without parole for the murder of Karen Pannell. The verdict stands, and legally, the case is closed. So when people hear about this case for the first time, they remember the wall. They remember the word written in blood, rock. And how shocking it is to imagine a dying woman pointing a finger at her killer in her final moments. It feels cinematic. It feels definitive. And for a brief time, it sent investigators in exactly the direction that you'd expect. But this case was never solved by what was written on the wall. It was solved by what couldn't be explained away. As we've walked through this episode, and as we discussed in part 1, once the forensics, timelines, and human testimony were laid side by side, the message stopped behaving like a dying declaration and started behaving like a lie, a deliberate one, written not in desperation, but in calculation. Karen Pannell did not die quickly. She was stabbed 16 times. She suffered catastrophic injuries to her spine, to her chest, and to her heart. Medical evidence showed that she would have been paralyzed and rapidly bleeding out, physically incapable of standing, reaching, or carefully forming letters on the wall. The bloodstain evidence showed those letters were added later, over dried spatter by a right-handed gloved writer. And the timeline, built from a pizza delivery, cell tower records, and neighbors who had no reason to lie, kept placing one person at or near that townhouse again and again, long after he claimed to be gone. The DNA under Karen's fingernails told the same story. So did the confession that George Solomon testified to hearing, whether you believe every word of it or not, because it fit the physical evidence in ways coincidence simply cannot explain. This wasn't a stranger slipping in and out unseen. This wasn't a mystery attacker who left no trace. And it wasn't a tragic accident or a moment that spun out of control. Legally, the jury weighed all of that and reached a verdict. The courts reviewed it. The conviction stood. But beyond the courtroom, this case leaves us with something harder, because Karen didn't die because of a word on a wall. She died because she learned the truth about the man that she was with, about his past, his violence, and the danger that he represented. And she tried to pull away. That moment, the exit moment, is one of the most dangerous points in any abusive relationship. And this case follows that pattern with chilling precision. Karen was not reckless. She was not spiraling. She was building a life. She bought a new car. She made plans. She reached out. She tried to protect herself. And she was killed for it. When we talk about this case, it's important not to let the spectacle overshadow the person at the center of it. Karen Pannell was not a symbol, a forensic puzzle, or a plot twist. She was a daughter, a sister, a co-worker, and a woman who deserved to wake up the next morning in her own home. The blood on that wall was meant to confuse, but the truth, piece by piece, refused to stay buried. And in the end, what was written in blood wasn't a name, it was a lie. And the evidence told the rest of the story. Before we move into the victim tribute, I want to pause for a moment and explain something new that we're beginning here at Dark Dialogue. When we honor victims on this show, we're intentional about how we do it, not just in the words that we choose, but in the space we create. Moving forward, some of these tributes will be accompanied by original music, used not as background, but as part of the moment itself. For this episode, and for future tributes, we're working in collaboration with J.J. Hawk, an independent band whose music carries the kind of emotional restraint and honesty these stories demand. Their work is produced through their own independent production arm, Hawk Studios, giving them full creative control over how their music is created and shared. Their music is available everywhere people listen: Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, iHeart. But here, it serves a different purpose. The song you're about to hear is called Paper Wings. It's a piece that sits with fragility, disorientation, and quiet endurance, the kind of emotional space that words alone sometimes can't hold. It doesn't explain anything. It doesn't ask for attention. It simply allows room for reflection. As this music plays beneath the tribute, we ask you to listen with care, not just to what happened, but to who this person was and to the life that existed beyond the headlines. This is Karen Pannell, and this is Paper Wings by J.J. Hawk.
You trace the lines where dreams unfold, a quiet flame in the
Before we end this episode, we need to come back to Karen, not to the crime scene, not to the courtroom, and not to the word written in blood that so many people fixate on when they first hear about this case. We need to come back to the woman who lived in that space before violence ever entered it. Karen Pannell was 39 years old. She was not drifting, and she was not lost. She was not unraveling. By every account from friends, family, and coworkers, she was grounded, the kind of person who showed up, who kept her life moving forward, and who took responsibility for her own future. She worked, she planned, she cared about the people around her. She wasn't looking for chaos, and she wasn't inviting danger. She was doing what so many people do in midlife, reassessing relationships, making adjustments, and choosing what and who no longer fit. In part one, we talked about Karen's life before October 10th, 2003, about her routines, her independence, and the way that she navigated the world. And in this episode, we've spent a lot of time on evidence, testimony, and timelines. But none of that explains who Karen was when she woke up that morning. She was someone who believed that she had time. Time to make changes. Time to draw boundaries. Time to walk away from something that no longer felt right. When Karen learned the truth about the man that she was dating, not rumors, not vague warning, but confirmed information from law enforcement, she did not ignore it. She didn't rationalize it away. She didn't convince herself that love or loyalty required silence. She listened. That moment matters because it cuts directly against one of the most persistent and damaging myths surrounding intimate partner violence. That victims somehow failed to act, failed to see the danger, or failed to protect themselves. Karen acted. She absorbed new information. She talked to people that she trusted. She began pulling back. She was in the process of leaving, emotionally and practically. And that process is one of the most dangerous phases in an abusive relationship. That is not speculation. That is pattern. And Karen's story fits it with devastating precision. What happened to her was not the result of carelessness or bad judgment. It was the result of someone else refusing to let go of control. Her family was left to pick up what violence shattered. They had to endure a trial that dissected Karen's final moments in graphic and clinical terms. Wounds counted, movements debated, blood analyzed. Not because it honored her, but because the system demands proof. And through that process, they did what families in these cases are forced to do. Hold on to the memory of who Karen was while listening to strangers describe how she died. Her stepmother and her brother spoke not about anger, but about loss, about the horror of knowing Karen spent her final moments alone, in fear and in pain, and the impossibility of reconciling a life built over decades with a death that came in minutes. They wanted Karen remembered not as evidence, but as a person. That's what we owe her here. Karen was not defined by a single night. She was defined by years of relationships, work, laughter, plans, and quiet moments that never make it into police reports. She was someone who deserved to be safe in her own home, not just in theory, but in reality. She deserved the chance to finish the life that she was actively building. When we tell this story, especially one so visually striking and emotionally charged, we have to resist the pull of spectacle. The bloodstain analysis, the staged message, the courtroom drama, those details matter, but they are not the point. Karen is the point. She is not a cautionary tale. She is not a forensic puzzle. She is not a name written on a wall. She was a woman who trusted, learned, reassessed, and tried to protect herself. And remembering her that way, clearly, honestly, and without distortion, is one of the few things that we can still give to her. Karen Pannell mattered, her life mattered, and her story deserves to be told with care. Karen Pannell's story is difficult to sit with, not because the evidence is unclear, but because it is. This is one of those cases where the truth doesn't arrive all at once. It arrives piece by piece through forensics, timelines, and human behavior that refuses to line up with innocence. What makes it harder is knowing that Karen did what so many people are told to do. She paid attention. She asked questions. She tried to step away from something that felt wrong. And that moment, the moment of clarity and separation, is often the most dangerous. If there's anything this case asks of us as listeners, it's to take intimate partner violence seriously before it reaches a courtroom. To listen when someone says they're afraid, and to understand that control doesn't always look loud. Sometimes it looks calm right up until it isn't.
And cases like this also remind us why it's so important to keep telling these stories carefully. Not for shock value, not for spectacle, but so victims like Karen aren't reduced to headlines or forensic details. She was a real person with a full life, and that deserves to be remembered. Not just how she died, but how she lived and what she was trying to protect when she made the choices she did. If you or someone you know is in a situation that feels unsafe, there are resources, and reaching out can matter more than you realize.
If you found any value in this episode, if you believe stories like Karen's deserve to be told with depth and with respect, please take a moment to support the show. Like this episode, share it with someone who listens thoughtfully, leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Those reviews genuinely help independent shows like this reach new listeners. If you're watching on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and hit that bell so you don't miss future episodes. You can also follow Dark Dialogue on social media, where we share episode updates, research notes, and upcoming projects across the network.
If you want to support the work more directly, you can check out our links for Ko-fi, Patreon, and Substack. Those contributions help us keep these investigations independent, in-depth, and accessible. And if you're interested in honoring victims beyond the podcast, take a look at our victim tribute page on the Dark Dialogue site. Those spaces are built to remember the people behind the cases, not just the crimes committed against them. Thank you for spending this time with us and for staying present through a difficult story. It matters more than you know.
As always, take care of yourselves and each other. And until next time, keep the dialogue alive.